Hello, everyone. Welcome to our continuing study of the book of Esther. Today we will be looking together at chapter 2. And in chapter 2, the story is related how an orphaned Jewish girl, a captive people, and yet she ends up as the queen of the king Ahasuerus, or Xerxes, of the mighty Persian Empire. And so the second chapter tells us how her cousin and her guardian, Mordecai, with her help, will save the king from assassination. Let's begin, first of all, in the first 4 verses, looking together at the king's plan to replace Queen Vashti. In our last study, she refused to be paraded before a group of drunken men, and she was deposed. And now the king needs a new queen. And after these things, when the anger of King Ahasuerus had subsided, he remembered Vashti and what she had done and what had been decreed against her. Then the king's attendants who served him said, "Let beautiful young virgins be sought for the king. Let the king appoint overseers in all the provinces of his kingdom, that they may gather every beautiful young virgin to the citadel of Susa, to the harem, into the custody of Hegai, the king's eunuch, who is in charge of the women, and let their cosmetics be given them. Then let the young lady who pleases the king be queen in the place of Vashti." And the matter pleased the king, and he did accordingly. I'll say more than once as we go through this narrative that the writer is not holding up the example of Mordecai or Esther or anyone else as being the template by which we ought to live. But he is strictly relating a historical narrative and expects that the Christian would apply the principles of Christian thought to the kinds of things that we see. In verse 1, after these things, that phrase suggests an indefinite period of time. Since chapter 2 and verse 16 says that Esther was taken to the king in the 7th year of King Ahasuerus, or about 479 BC. And chapter 1, verse 3 says that the king held his banquet for the nobles in his 3rd year, about 483 BC. Esther's ascension to the throne must necessarily have occurred about 4 years after Vashti had been deposed. In the meantime, Xerxes, or Ahasuerus, had launched his campaign in the attempt to conquer the Greeks. Then, in 480 BC, the vast Persian forces won dramatic victories over a smaller Greek army at Thermopylae. That was a land battle. And at Artemisium on the sea. However, the Persians were beaten at the Battle of Salamis on the sea, and the next year, 479 BC, they suffered a decisive defeat at Plataea on the land, and that brought the invasion of Greece to an end. According to the historian Herodotus, the Xerxes consoled himself in such times of distress with the pleasures of women. According to the book of Esther, when the king's anger had subsided, he remembered Vashti and his decree against her. These words sound as if the writer is implying that Xerxes regretted the rash action that he had taken and wished to reinstate her, but of course he's prevented by his own decree because it is irrevocable. Or perhaps it means that his thoughts now turn to a replacement for the queen. Since the king had made a decree that couldn't be changed, he could not simply restore Vashti to her place of prominence. So he's forced to pose the question, what can I do to replace the queen? And in verses 2 through 4, just as the princes had advised him to rid himself of the queen in chapter 1, verses 13 through 20, his attendants now advise him on how he can locate a new queen to take the place of Vashti. And they suggest that an empire-wide search for beautiful young virgins be brought to the palace at Susa so that he might take his pick. Once they are added to the harem, they're to be treated with cosmetics and pampered and groomed and prepared for the king's pleasure. In verse 3, then the king would choose one of these young women to take the place of Vashti as his queen. Ahasuerus accepted the attendant's advice, and he made plans to bring that about. He was pleased with the suggestion, and he did all that they suggested, and he gave orders that it be made a reality. The writer didn't comment, as I've indicated, on the morality or the immorality of this plan. Some have attacked it vehemently, and they assume that these girls were forcibly taken from their homes and were in effect raped by the king, and that they were forced to live in the king's harem for the rest of their days. Well, it may be that the king did that or something similar to that, and it may be regarded by some the equivalent of rape, maybe even some of the girls. But that's not a necessary conclusion. Some of them may have seen it as a form of slavery, but that's not a necessary conclusion, because it is also possible that many of the young maidens in that pagan empire would have welcomed the opportunity to live in luxury in the king's palace, even if it required them to satisfy the king's sexual desires now and then. It seems at least possible that many young women in that kingdom wouldn't need to be forced to participate in this contest. Certainly no part of that plan coincides with God's law and with the ethics that Scripture teaches in the Old or the New Testament. It just does not. However, most of the people involved in the plan were pagans. And it's most likely that this kind of conduct and behavior is common in the culture. And we might argue that these kind of practices reflect the low standards of a society without God. We might well be repelled by it, for it is repugnant, but we shouldn't be surprised by it. Paul writes in Romans chapter 1, for example, verses 18 through 32, of the depths of depravity to which it is possible for a society to fall to without God. In verses 5 through 14 of the chapter, we read of Esther's entry into this contest. And at this point, you see, we have the introduction of the main character, or one of the main characters of the book, the introduction of Esther. Let's note, first of all, verses 5 through 7. Now there was at the citadel in Susa a Jew whose name was Mordecai, the son of Jair, the son of Shimei, the son of Kish, a Benjamite, who had been taken into exile from Jerusalem with the captives who had been exiled with Jeconiah, king of Judah, whom Nebuchadnezzar, the king of Babylon, had exiled. He was bringing up Hadassah, that is Esther, his uncle's daughter, for she had no father or mother. Now the young lady was beautiful of form and face. And when her father and her mother died, Mordecai took her as his own daughter. Verses 5 and 6, the first observation we make is the introduction of another Jewish person living in the citadel of Susa, one of the principal administrative cities in this great empire. And his name is Mordecai. And he is the great-grandson of Kish. Kish was the Benjaminite. And he had been taken into Babylonian captivity by Nebuchadnezzar. at the same time that Jeconiah, the king of Judah, was exiled. Jeconiah is another name for Jehoiakim, who was carried away into the Babylonian captivity by Nebuchadnezzar in the year 597 BC. You can read about that in 2 Kings chapter 24, verses 8 through 17. Some believe that verse 6 is telling us that Mordecai was himself carried away into captivity at the time of Jeconiah's capture, which would have made him more than 100 years old at the time of the events of Esther, and it would have made Esther at least 60 or 70. C.F. Kyle, while rejecting this proposal, said the words had been taken into exile, that phrase refers to Mordecai only in the sense that he belonged to those Jews who were carried to Babylon by Nebuchadnezzar with Jeconiah, so that though born in captivity, he was carried to Babylon in the person of his forefathers. A more straightforward way to see that is that the reference being taken to exile only describes Kish. The fact that Mordecai's ancestors had been taken into captivity with Jehoiakim likely emphasizes that they are from a prominent family. Mordecai himself would have been born in exile, and his name seems to have been derived from Marduk. Marduk was the chief of the Babylonian pantheon of gods. He may have had a Jewish name as well, just as Esther did. You know, her Jewish name was Hadassah, which means myrtle. She was an orphan, we learn here. We learn a number of things. She was known as Hadassah. She was an orphan and had no father and mother, for they had died. Consequently, her cousin Mordecai raised her as his own daughter, and we learn that she was beautiful of form and face. Beautiful of face is literally of appearance. The English Standard Version renders this: she had a beautiful figure and was lovely to look at. Esther's preparation for the contest is related in verses 8 through 11. So it came about when the command and decree of the king were heard, and many young ladies were gathered to the citadel of Susa into the custody of Hegai, that Esther was taken to the king's palace into the custody of Hegai, who was in charge of the women. Now the young lady pleased him and found favor with him, so he quickly provided her with cosmetics and food and gave her 7 choice maids from the king's palace and transferred her and her maids to the best place in the harem. Esther did not make known her people or her kindred, for Mordecai had instructed her that she should not make them known. Every day Mordecai walked back and forth in front of the court of the harem to learn how Esther was and how she fared. So the story here relates to us that this fair and beautiful young woman became a candidate to be queen. And in verse 8, Esther was just one of many, many young women who were brought to the king's palace, literally to his house in Susa, to take part in this contest to replace Queen Vashti. Some commentators insist that Esther and the other women were forced to participate in this process. But you don't find that in the text. While that may be true, we need to remember yet again that the writer's purpose is not to teach lessons regarding morality, nor is it his purpose to encourage young women to follow the example of Esther in everything that she does in this context. He is merely relating the events and explaining along the way how God can accomplish his purposes working through human beings, even sinful, mistake-prone, fallible human beings. Since the writer reported what happened without indicating his approval or disapproval, Christian expositors should not feel obligated to excuse Esther's seemingly questionable behavior. Verse 9, immediately Esther won the favor of Hegai, the king's eunuch. This man was in charge of the women. In other words, he's in charge of the king's harem. Hegai showed partiality to Esther in providing her with cosmetics and food, literally portions. And the implication is that he gave her more than he gave any of the others. Also, he appointed to her 7 choice maids to look after her and transferred her with her attendants to the best place in the harem. And through the sequence of events, this Jewish orphan is given the best living quarters among the women under Heggai's care. And the help offered to her by this Gentile, this pagan man, more than likely, proved invaluable in Esther's winning the crown. We come to verse 10, and although Mordecai allowed Esther to be taken into the king's harem, whether he had a choice or not, we don't know, but he continued to influence her and to do the very best that he could to take care of her. One of the instructions that he had given her was not to reveal that she was Jewish. Why Mordecai thought it was a bad idea for Esther to reveal that she's Jewish is not explained. To say the least, the fact introduces the idea that the Jews were somehow viewed negatively within the empire by significant segments of the population. And one who was a Jew was somehow at a disadvantage. In this way, the theme of anti-Semitism is hinted at early in the narrative. Esther obediently followed Mordecai's counsel. She did as he said. And by doing so, she obviously differed from Daniel and from Daniel's friends, who, when they're brought to a strange country, respectfully reject the king's choice food and ate vegetables in order to maintain a kosher diet. You'll see that in Daniel chapter 1. The writer didn't comment on Esther's failure to observe such rituals at the palace of Susa. He had nothing to say about that. Verse 11, Mordecai watched over Esther by constantly maintaining a spot near the court of the harem. And the fact that he was able to spend so much of his time in this way suggests that he was probably a leading member of the Jewish community, and some think that his place at the king's gate implies that he was a government official of some sort. In verses 12 through 14, we learn about the rules of the contest. Now, when the turn of each young lady came to go in to King Ahasuerus after the end of her 12 months under the regulations for the women, for the days of their beautification were completed as follows: 6 months with oil of myrrh, and 6 months with spices and the cosmetics for women. The young lady would go in to the king in this way, and anything that she desired was given to her to take with her from the harem to the king's palace. In the evening she would go in, and in the morning she would return to the second harem, to the custody of Shaashgaz, the king's eunuch, who was in charge of the concubines. She would not again go into the king unless the king delighted in her and she was summoned by name. So before he relates the results of Esther's being taken to the palace, the writer explains how the contest was conducted. In verses 12 and 13, according to the rules, each young lady was to spend 12 months in beautification and making preparation for her night with the king. She was to be anointed with the oil of myrrh for 6 months, and then other spices and cosmetics for the rest of the year. Then when the time came, she could take with her anything from the harem that she chose as she goes into the king. In verse 14, the young woman would visit the king's quarters in the evening, and the next morning she would be transferred to the second harem. This group was comprised of women who had already had sexual relations with the king, and they were considered the king's concubines. While the first harem of young virgins was under the supervision of Haggai, the second harem was taken care of by Ashkenaz, another eunuch. After the young women after a young woman, I should say, had become one of the king's concubines, she couldn't return to the king without a specific summons. If he delighted in her and summoned her by name, only then could she come into his presence. While they did benefit from the amenities of the palace, those rejected lived the rest of their lives like widows. Although we sometimes think of this competition as a beauty contest, it's obviously a whole lot more than that. The girls were evaluated on the basis of an overnight stay with the king, and the story of Esther was obviously, catch this now, the story of Esther was obviously not told to recommend that godly young women follow the example of Esther by acting immorally to please the king or anybody else. We've been told what happened, not what should have happened. We come to verses 15 through 18, and we see how the king selects Esther. Now, when the turn of Esther, the daughter of Abihail, the uncle of Mordecai, who had taken her as his daughter, came to go into the king, she didn't request anything except what Haggai, the king's eunuch, who was in charge of the women, advised. And Esther found favor in the eyes of all who saw her. So Esther was taken to King Ahasuerus to his royal palace in the 10th month, which is the month of Tebeth, in the 7th year of his reign. The king loved Esther more than all the women, and she found favor and kindness with him more than all of the virgins, so that he set the royal crown on her head and made her queen instead of Vashti. Then the king gave a great banquet, Esther's banquet, for all his princes and his servants. He also made a holiday for the provinces and gave gifts according to the king's bounty. So with special help from the king's eunuch in charge of the contestants, Esther won the contest and became queen of the empire. In verse 15, when it's her turn to go in to the king, she carefully follows the advice Haggai, the king's eunuch, gave her. And apparently he knew what would please the king. He knew how to give her an advantage, which he did. In addition to gaining Haggai's approval, Esther found favor in the eyes of all who saw her. And this must be a tribute not only to her physical beauty, but also to her winning personality. In verse 16, the date of that memorable night is given. It was the 10th month, which is the month of Tebeth, in the 7th year of Ahasuerus' reign. This was either December 479 BC or January of 478 BC. For the Jews, it was a historic occasion, the beginning of Esther's triumphal ascent to the throne of Persia. In verse 17, Esther won the king's heart. He loved her more than all the women, and so showed more kindness than he demonstrated to any of the virgins in the contest. And he went so far as to place the royal crown on her head and made her queen in Vashti's place. In verse 18, the king gave a great banquet to celebrate Esther's ascension to the throne and declared a holiday for the provinces as part of a celebration and gave gifts to the people to express his joy. The Hebrew word that is here translated holiday occurs this one time in the entire Old Testament. and its meaning is debated by linguists. The term may denote rest, but it is translated in the Septuagint as release. Several versions understand the term to signify simply a holiday. Yet others take it to mean the remission of taxes. Regarding that, Herodotus, who wrote about an earlier Persian ruler, tells us that subjects were freed from paying tribute by this ruler, and they were freed from obligatory military service for a time. And so there's precedent for that kind of thing among these people. The plot of the story has therefore completed its first stage of development. As queen, Esther is now in a position to save the people who would be threatened with extermination. Any reader might be amazed by the fortuitous turn of events and yet very unlikely group of coincidences that elevate an orphan girl to the throne. However, a more biblical response is to see these circumstances as being brought about by the guiding hand of God, who is working providentially to accomplish his purposes. One scholar, Alexander Carson, put it like this: "Is there any man so blind as not to perceive that it was entirely providential that one of the small number of captive Jews should be found more beautiful than all the virgins of 127 provinces? Can anyone question that God gave her that exquisite loveliness for this occasion?" Mordecai, we will see in verses 19 through 23, saves the king's life. It says, "When the virgins were gathered together the second time, then Mordecai was sitting at the king's gate. Esther had not yet made known her kindred or her people, even as Mordecai had commanded her. For Esther did what Mordecai told her, as she had done when she was in his care. In those days, while Mordecai was sitting at the king's gate, Bigthan and Teresh, two of the king's officials from those who guarded the door, became angry and sought to lay hands on King Ahasuerus. But the plot became known to Mordecai. And he told Queen Esther, and Esther informed the king in Mordecai's name. Now when the plot was investigated and found to be so, they were both hanged on a gallows, and it was written in the book of the Chronicles in the king's presence." In the last two paragraphs of this chapter, the reader learns about something Esther didn't tell the king, and something that she did tell the king. And both facts are important in the events that follow. In verse 19, the second time has been explained in a variety of ways. Michael V. Fox thought that the best explanation is that the passage is referring to the gathering of the virgins into the second harem. Such an explanation makes sense, since the appointment of Esther as queen should have meant the end of the contest. Perhaps the idea is that any candidate who had not yet transferred to the second harem would therefore move to that harem without having their night with the king. During this time, Mordecai was sitting at the king's gate outside the palace. And as chapter 2 and verse 11 suggest, he spent as much time as possible there to be near his adopted daughter and to try to learn how Esther was, how she fared. In verse 20, the writer inserts some information that is important later in the story. Esther had not revealed to Ahasuerus that she was a Jewess. He commended Esther because, among her other virtues, she had always acted as an obedient daughter to her cousin and adoptive father, Mordecai. The writer acknowledges that, extols that. In verse 21, while he was sitting at the king's gate, Mordecai overheard two of the guards plotting to lay hands on, that is, to assassinate the king. The assassination of kings was not an uncommon occurrence in the ancient Near East. In fact, this king, Ahasuerus, did eventually fall to a similar plot when at the end of 465, Ahasuerus was assassinated in his bedchamber. In verses 22 and 3, Mordecai relayed this plot to Queen Esther, and she reports it to Ahasuerus in the name of Mordecai. And as a result, these two would-be assassins are hanged on a gallows, and Mordecai's good deed was recorded in the book of the Chronicles of the Kingdom. The incident appears to be a digression from the primary point of the account. And one who does not know the rest of the story might find it interesting, but wonder why it's included. However, these events are extremely important, and they foreshadow the climax of the narrative. Because Mordecai accidentally overheard this plot, two evil men were hanged. And at this time, the king was saved and the incident was written down. Later, Mordecai's historic recorded deed was unintentionally brought to the king's attention, resulting in the hanging of another evil man. And I hope that you will stay with this study from week to week, and as we come to the conclusion of this fascinating story. May God bless you.